coming from a centre-right think tank, I approach things a little bit differently from many people, but follow many of the same themes that Peter covered. But I want to get back to basics to start with. So before you ask, how do you pay for green infrastructure in an age of austerity, I want to ask why we should. Because actually I think that argument has yet to be won amongst policymakers. And there are far more than these benefits. I'm not even going to read through them, you all know this instinctively. And these are just a few of the major benefits that green infrastructure provides. We all know they're great places to spend time in. But we still haven't made a business case, an evidence case, for why green infrastructure should have millions of pounds worth of funding ploughed into it at a time when, for example, the NHS, schools and housing are such major issues. Then again, 93% of the public in England think that it's important to have green spaces close to them. 93%. That's a phenomenal proportion of the electorate, I would say. So that's a pretty powerful voice. You just need to be able to capture it. Almost 3 billion visits last year alone. And every year, friends and park user groups, as Peter managed to find out in his State of UK Parks report, managed to raise £30 million. That's every year for their parks and green spaces. They are critically important. We've been working on green spaces since 2013. 2 reports. They are free to download from our website, and I would encourage you, please do download and read them, because there are far more recommendations in here than I can possibly cover. Mainly because there is absolutely no one-size-fits-all solution to parks and green spaces, just like there is no average park. Every park will be different and will have different needs and requirements and ways of being able to generate money. So just over the next 10 minutes or so, I'm going to be running through a couple of the main issues and some of the main recommendations, but just reiterating that austerity has yet to reach its peak. The Barnett graph of doom, some of you may have heard of. By 2017-18, local authority budgets are going to be almost 100% dealing with adult and social care. There's going to be very little left over for non-statutory duties like green spaces. So in order to build an evidence case to be able to get funding from non-traditional sources, shall we say, maybe health, education, transport, crime even, we need to be able to answer these really basic questions. How much green space do we have? Roughly 27,000 or so, but we're not really entirely sure. There's no data available. Again, we don't really know where they are. Each local authority will have a bit of an idea, well, pretty good idea really, but at a national level, we're running blind. What state are they in? Other than the survey that Peter did, Green Flag is really the only objective, regularly assessed measure, and that only covers a handful of the parks that we've got. DCLG only records the amount of spending that local authorities spend on open space, which, of course, green space is only a part of. It can also include grey open spaces. And we have no idea how much of our green spaces are publicly accessible yet. I'll come on to that later. And how have they changed over time? We don't really know. Peter's report is a great snapshot in time to compare with the 2001 survey or 2000 survey. But again, it's very much rough guesswork. But there are 2 main problems with this. Yes, it's true that we do need to focus on quality of green space, absolutely. However, London's for example, one of the greenest cities of its size in the world, and the UK is actually blessed in having very green cities in comparison with, for example, the US or parts of Asia. So it covers quite a large area. How on earth do you fund increases in quality over such a large area? But also, even given that you've got all this green space, it's very unevenly distributed. I did a bit of GIS work because I'm a bit of a map geek, and found that in London alone, the 25% least deprived areas have access to more than double the amount of green spaces than the 25% most deprived. So how do you reconcile the location of green spaces and the quality? So we are making progress on the data side of things. In September, Nick Clegg announced that Ordnance Survey, our national mapping agency, was going to be releasing a map of publicly accessible green space. Fingers crossed that will be out at some point. I don't even know which year. Hopefully this year, we'll see. But that is a major positive. Once that's available, it'll be a base map on which you can start layering up further information. People will be able to start putting in quality and ratings, so you could have a TripAdvisor for parks, for example. And the second announcement was earlier this year. Matthew Hancock announced that Ordnance Survey would be moving to become a government company. In theory, this could be a major win for the open data agenda. We'll see how that pans out. But of course, data isn't everything. And so our second report, Green Society, covered funding and also how communities could get more involved with their green spaces, because at the end of the day, communities are going to have to be able to pick up at least some of the slack. They're not going to be able to fund the total, to fill the gap completely. Volunteers need help as much as anyone else, but there is potential for them to be far more involved and to play a far greater role. So this report covered a huge range of different policy recommendations. I'm only going to cover three very, very quickly. The first is endowments, which Peter's already mentioned. A very sustainable funding model if the investment is managed properly. In theory, it could give you far more security, even through recessions. It will get you out of a boom and bust cycle of parks funding, where you end up having massive capital improvements, gradual deterioration, and then needing a massive capital injection again. And they can also act as match funding for grants. So you end up being able to generate even more money for a green space. Great examples, Milton Keynes Park Trust and the Land Trust. But the upfront cost, Peter Neal suggested this come out of stamp duty. I would suggest perhaps alternatively, or maybe even in addition, local authorities still do have at least some role to play for some green spaces, not necessarily for all of them, but the decision needs to be made at a strategic level so that it's the right green space that's funded and that the maintenance that's provided is what the communities require. Also, developer contributions, really major source of funding, and frankly, that green spaces should be being paid for through endowments by developers when they're developing new housing developments. Green prescribing. This has been around for a while, but it hasn't really kicked off in a major way as yet. The basic premise is if you go to the GP, you're feeling isolated, maybe you have depression, maybe you're somewhat overweight, and assuming there are no other health complications, they could say, well, here's a green prescription for a course of ecotherapy or a Walking for Health initiative, your walking group in your local park. Part funded by the CCG, the patient provides the general prescription fee, prescription charge, and the CCG funds the remainder of the cost. The provider will then have an agreement with the local authority to use the park, so at least some of the funds go from healthcare through to the local authority and then to park maintenance. But if, for example, the activity is involving horticulture or ecotherapy, that also provides some benefits to the park. Again, it won't be suitable for all places, but it is a potential model, and it has some indirect policy support through the 2006 and 2010 health papers. The difficulty is there's a mismatch between policy and practice. So a Nesta survey found that 90% of GPs think that social prescribing is a great idea, but only a sixth regularly offer it. Partly that's a lack of data issue, which we covered in our Parkland report. So we're recommending that as a minimum, there should be an audit of existing green prescribing schemes, because they are there, and Scotland's done an audit. It should be done for England as well. And perhaps the most controversial from a local authority perspective, council tax rebate for volunteering. I know some aren't a big fan of this, considering, coming from a rather purist approach, that volunteers are doing volunteering for the joy of volunteering, which some people do. However, most volunteers are over 35 and white. there is huge potential to attract others. And if that involves a financial reward for working in your local green space, developing a far stronger and more cohesive community, I don't see anything wrong with that. The other advantage, of course, is that it can encourage long-term volunteering for parks and, in theory, help prevent adversarial relationships. A lot of friends groups are set up in response to a threat or a perceived threat to their green space. So you then end up having a fight with your local authority, which can then reduce your entrepreneurial ability. What's important with this is that each local authority would have the ability to set its own rebate level on its own conditions. So it's completely flexible. And it's not new. Southampton City Council in 2013 started offering a 100% council tax rebate to special constables who live and work in Southampton. Northampton Borough Council, it's a bit more complicated, but if you're a council housing applicant with reasonable preference status and you've worked for at least 10 hours a month for at least 6 months before your application for council housing and before the point of offer, you're given preferential status. You get bumped up the list. So those two examples show that this kind of scheme doesn't have to be complicated, it doesn't have to be expensive, and it doesn't have to provide a huge burden on providers to provide lots of data on who is and isn't volunteering. So in conclusion, in terms of the data side of things, which is necessary to build the business case for non-traditional sources of funding for parks, there is some encouraging progress, but there is still work to do. And in terms of funding, there are lots and lots of different options, and do have a look at the Nesta Rethinking Parks website as well, because they're doing some great work. Endowments, green prescribing and council tax are promising approaches, but not the only ones. And we do need to retain some flexibility in the system because, as you all know, each green space is different. Thank you very much.